final session of our webinar today on nonviolent leadership is about developing the next generation of leaders. And we have very fortunately with us some incredible people for this discussion. First and foremost, we have Gandhi, speaking from South Africa. And as you know, she is the granddaughter of Mahatma Gandhi. So a great pleasure to have her with us. We have Pietro Ameglio from Mexico, who is a professor and a activist on nonviolence with both indigenous and peasant groups. And we have Manish Jain, who is a longtime specialist in deschooling and has taken up coordinates. He was the founder of Shankshantar in India, which is the People's Institute for Rethinking Education. And he's also the co-founder of Swaraj University. We will be joined later, I hope, by Arsen Kharatyan, who is from Armenia. He is heading ALIC Media in Armenia and Georgia, and one of the founders of the Citizens Contract Party, which is the ruling party in Armenia today. Now, dear guest speakers, I just want to share with you some of the thoughts that people had over the course of the day. I know some of you saw part of the presentation, but perhaps not the whole one from morning. And what I observed from the morning is the statement was made by the first session. Those were Maya Sotano Ing and Shashi Tharoor and Bernard Drano, Rajgopal. They made the very interesting observation that we've been moving from a singular leadership to more collaborative leadership. And this is very different from populist leadership. Collaborative leadership assumes responsibility. And there was also the contention that their political culture is also changing, not only because of the COVID virus, but because of the changes that have been going on. Really, they traced back from the 2008 financial crisis, which has spun a new kind of political culture. And what they observed was that youth are getting more engaged in this political culture. A recent nonviolent meeting was held in Paris with 40,000 people, of which 90% were under 25 years of age. And so what what came out of the first session is really that already there is a next generation of youth leaders in the form of Greta Thunberg and many others. So I just wanted you to be aware of those statements. This was followed by a next session, session 2, which was looking at the leadership in social movements. And we had a vast array, 7 different social movement leaders that came together to speak on social movement and the importance of leadership. And one of the takeaways that I had was Kejal Savla, who was the youngest among them, spoke about how within her work in India, in Bombay, where she works with primarily urban youth, how they are increasingly taking up collective leadership. And this was interesting that it wasn't so much leaderless as leaderful. In other words, collective decision makers that are jointly taking decisions. And she cited the example of how in some decisions, some people take the decision, and in other cases, other people take the decision, and there's not a singular decision maker. And what was interesting was how the session itself took that up as a very important note of how social movement organizing is changing from 20 or 30 years ago. And another very important point that came up in the social movement session was how grassroots mobilization continues. This was said by Tony Kazan, who is a longtime land reform person in the Philippines. And he spoke, as did 2 or 3 others, about the importance of grassroots mobilization as the key to social movement organizing, but how the challenges have really changed and how engagement of the grassroots is much, much more difficult. We then moved into a 3rd session on community leadership. And we spoke with, again, people from Africa and the Caucasus and from Canada and Mexico. And it was clear that what came out was how the community leadership building really is stressing community autonomy in ways that have not been there before. You know, in the old days, when we used to bring community development leaders together, it was around projects by funding agencies or within the context of development assistance. And I think what we saw in the community leadership discussion was that leadership is emerging in various diverse ways. Sometimes they don't conform to our ideas of what community looks like. And they're challenging in very unique ways the status quo or those groups that are resisting the community leadership coming up. We then turn to the 3rd one, which I think many of you saw by looking at the chat list. But I just say that this was on educational leadership, and it stressed many, many things, which I can't. We had a person who was looking at how Muslim communities need to embrace much greater diversity, and really the Muslim religion is based on peace. So she spoke from a very, very interesting vantage point of a progressive Muslim perspective. We heard from a pedagogist who follows the Ferrerian method, who looks at emancipatory pedagogy, critical pedagogy as love, as something that is extremely vital to get people to deeply think and participate in their own education and empowerment, and how important school is as part of the community. And we also heard from the study hall in Lucknow, which has been working for many, many years to bring the women's issue into education and does a lot of activism in villages, getting students to be aware of how girls should be confident and be able to define education in a way that they are empowered. The study school is also a place where very marginalized women are also studying. So this was the educational workshop. And now we come to our workshop. And I just wanted to go through that because when you have 30 speakers before you who have said many things, I wanted to give you a hint on what those were some of those impressions that I had to carry our conversation further. Now, we have, if I could now turn it over to the panelists, but before doing so, just explain how we're going to structure this. We, again, having 3 rounds of questions. These questions have been given to our panelists. We do hope that the viewers will also give their questions so that after these 3 rounds, we will take up some of the questions on the chat. What is significant, I think, about this panel is having someone as eminent as Ila Gandhi on the panel and to raise from the Gandhian perspective some of the ways that we can look towards developing leaders in future, but also the benefit of having such far-sighted friends as Pietro and Manish. So should we begin with the first, maybe I'll just ask each of the panelists to just say hello. Arsen, have you arrived? Has Arsen arrived?
Yes.
Oh, then I would also very happily say that Arsen, we will also, we have introduced you, but if each of you, beginning with Ila, Pietro, Manish, Arsen, can just open the discussion by saying something that you feel is really important about this day and what you've heard, maybe just as by way of introduction before we go into the 3 questions. Ila, G, can I turn to you first?
Namaste and greetings to all of you. Thank you very much for inviting me on this panel and the whole day's discussion. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to participate in the entire discussion, but I believe that what I saw was absolutely brilliant and wonderful and something that the young people need today in order to, to take up the challenges that the future generations are going to face. I just want to say one thing before I say leave it to other panelists, and that is that unfortunately we are not giving the next generation a beautiful world. We are giving the next generation a world full of problems which they are going to be faced with. So that's what I see. And thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you so much, Ila G. Can everybody hear her? Ila G's voice is clear to the attendee?
Yes.
Good. Great.
It's clear to me for appearing later.
Introduce yourself and what strikes you about this conversation. Can you unmute yourself, Pietro?
Yes, thank you very much. It's a very spirit experience of sharing and learning. I think it was excellent, the introduction you made for not repeating and using well the few time we have in original things, and also understanding the richness that there was before, that I hope it will be afterwards shared in workshops and in communitarian groups for reflection, because it's very important to put that in actions and reflections. We are in complete syntony that the way is leadership and not isolated leaders. That's the way we have been taught by indigenous communities, by poor people communities of the cities. And we work and hope in young people, trying them to make a real change and not only a little moment in their lives. And they are really our teachers. We try to share these real experiences from Mexico and Latin America in the education part and in the social activist part, with the challenge of how to translate in our culture and way of life nonviolence, Gandhi, Mandela. It's not an easy challenge, but we try all to learn one from another.
Great, thank you, Pietro. Can I now turn to Manish? Can you just introduce yourself and say what strikes you about this topic?
Yeah, namaste everyone. Greetings from Udaipur. Very, very honored to be here, and very thrilled that this conversation has been happening this whole day. It's one of, I think, the need of the hour for humanity. I think that, I mean, for me, the question of nonviolent leadership has been one since my childhood. Growing up as a Jain, it's something that you can't escape. So I'm really happy that it's really being spread and taken far and wide. I think what struck to me from what you shared and what I listened to throughout the day was really the idea of a kind of shift into a participatory modes of leadership, or what you were calling about collaborative leadership. And I think that the kind of both the nature of the various crises that we're facing on the planet, and particularly the complexity and the uncertainty, which is because of the kind of way that lots of systems have become so interconnected and interwoven, it calls for us, I think, to bring in new forms of collective intelligence, new forms of trusteeship, new forms of seva into our leadership models. So I'm really excited to deepen this conversation around participatory leadership as well.
Thank you very much, Manish. And Arsen, can you just introduce yourself and say what draws you to this, idea of nonviolent leadership?
Thank you, Jill, and hello, everyone. I apologize again for joining the conversation a little later than I expected. I am in the Gandhi temple in Armenia, which is the 1st century, which shows how Byzantine or the whatever Western influence has been, and the remaining, a small, tiny remaining of the Hellenist culture, which was not eliminated by Christianity, on a land where we have a lot of fights and conflicts. And we actually believe that trying to solve those conflicts together is better than creating new ones. So I'm in Gandhi, and I want to say hello to everyone. I apologize for my late joining. I was in the middle of a rain and trying to get out of a cave. So we are fighting a lot of COVID here these days, and I decided not to stay at home this time, but to run out and be somewhere outside so I could clear up my mind. And I'm more than honored to be joining this conversation together with you. I don't know what exactly I would like to start with while talking about the nonviolent revolution that we had about 2 years ago, which seems to be successful, but the post-revolution is more difficult than one would have thought. And we are in the middle of discussing a lot of how we see nonviolence and a Gandhian way of doing things is possible these days, and how long you can last with that. So we have a lot to learn and to listen to you. You have gone that path for over 70 years now, and I may be learning more than trying to suggest. So I will be in the listening mode. Thank you, Jill.
Thank you, Arsen. So, Ila Ben, if I could just go to the first question with you first, which is, you know, a lot of the leadership studies today really emphasize or stress on traits of leaders. And I think what Mahatma Gandhi drew to our attention was how you bring thought, word, and deed closer together. You reduce the gap. How, in this day and age, do we get to a place where we can really value the words of leaders because we trust they will carry out what they say, because we feel so disillusioned with leaders who are not doing what they say? Can we get your response to this question?
So, Gandhiji always said, in my view, and that is that whatever we say or whatever we promise should be realistic. That if we say that we are going to do something which we know is beyond our control, it's beyond what we can manage, then that is not stating a fact. It is misleading people. And therefore, first attribute is to be realistic, to know that what you are going to say is something that you are going to be able to do. The second point that Gandhiji often talked about was that he alone couldn't do everything. He needed other people. And he always, right from the early days, he had a lot of young people around him. And he related to that energy. If you see in South Africa, he had Mr. Polak and he had Mr. Kallenbeck, both of whom were much younger than him. In India, there were many people. Dr. Kumarappa was much younger than him. And he was the advisor, financial advisor on economics, because he had studied economics. And Gandhiji was never, opposed to asking advice from other people, other experts. And what we see today, under the circumstances of COVID-19, is that we need to have scientists. For instance, in South Africa, which we admired so greatly about our president, was that he immediately put together a team of scientists and asked them, tell us, what is your opinion? What should we be doing? And it was this team of scientists, which is still advising the president, that advised him, and he continued to take the necessary steps. So he had the team of scientists, and then he brought all the political parties together, and he brought the community, the different sectors of the community, the workers, the employers, everyone together in order to make decisions. So when we do something and we are inclusive and we are prepared to take advice from specialists, then whatever we say becomes something that we can deliver on. But if we don't accept that advice and we think that we know everything and we think that we can alone deliver, then that becomes something that later on we are not going to be able to deliver and people will have no trust in us. So those are the three factors that I want to bring up. Firstly, that you bring other people on board, especially younger people. You bring specialists on board to get advice from them. And thirdly, to bring the community together, different sectors of the community together so that they understand what is the process. So there are different sectors that have different leaderships, and you bring them all together so that you have a common understanding and perspective. And I think that those are the three factors I would like to talk about. I mean, I think are important. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very, very interesting, those three factors that you've mentioned. Pietro, can we go to you now? Then we'll come back to you for more elaboration on those factors a little later. Pietro, can we turn to you now in terms of looking at leadership today and the challenges?
Yes, I continue with Ella's reflection. With real experiments we have here, they are little but real, and most of them with young people. Once I read many time ago something of Gandhi that gave me a key for life and for working with others. It was about coherence. And he said, if I say something today and last week I said something different, please forget what I said last week and make what I say today. This, I think, is a very important reflection because makes us understand that coherence, of course, is not changing opinion every day, but it's a way of opening head and mind to changing the reflection. We call it reality principle, that it's key for us for struggling and for thinking. And we think one of the first nonviolent weapons is reflection, and another is the body. So it's important to understand, and also for young people, that we must be able to change reflection if reality principle changes and the social dynamic changes. That sense of coherence is very important because, for example, one of the main problems of leadership in Mexico and of leaders is that they don't put the body inside of nonviolent actions in proportional of the level of violent actions. That for us is a very key strategic situation and made that violence and inhumanity grew up so quickly and hardly because leaders of the moral reserve in the country that have a social power important are an important non-violent weapon against power and inhumanity. They have the capacity of stopping many situations with their bodies in the public space, in the streets, and in situation of the border frontier of humanity in our societies, they didn't do any kind of proportional nonviolent actions. So the coherence between the words and the actions didn't happen. And that is one of the main problems we have in nonviolent strategic against the war we have in our country. I think another important thing is with the experience that we must teach from below to above leaders. The son must teach his father, the student must teach his professor. We must be able permanently to correct, to stop what is not right, but with reflection. We call that to build an equalization principle. We call that to build a kind of horizontal relations. But that's not mechanical, that's not made with words. That must be done with actions and reflections. And all the kind of methods we use with young and not young people are in that line, how to break the power asymmetry in the hierarchical relations and real build kind of equalization relations and horizontal relations. And in that sense, one thing we work a lot for breaking that, not only with words, but in reality, is that we must try to make awareness that blind obedience is not the way, nor catechism of nonviolence. We work very much in that line because, and more with young people, catechism of values, of what to do, doesn't work
Right.
longer than 10 minutes. So this awareness process makes us put energy in how to break that blind obedience. I don't know if my time finished.
I think we'll leave it at that and come back to to a further elaboration of the process you're talking about. Manish Bhai, can you come in here? You know, as someone who works so much with young people as well, and speak a little bit about the question.
Yes, thank you, Ben. I think what I would like to just share right now is about a need to kind of re-engage the stories and the metaphors that are being used. And one thing is, I think sometimes we get very caught up with this narrative of good versus evil leaders. And I think the danger of that is that we forget a kind of larger analysis of the systems that we live in. And I think I call this big picture activism is what we need. And we share this with a lot of our young people. So I think what I would, one thing that is very interesting for me is, and I think Gandhiji raised that when he wrote Hind Swaraj. I still consider that one of his most important texts, and the one that has probably least been understood amongst the Gandhians that I've encountered. But I think what we did was actually, so one is this narrative of good versus evil in the leaders. The second thing of narrative we kind of latched on was the be the change narrative. And I think that is an insufficient narrative in today's world. I think the be the change narrative has to be married with the be the change plus change the game. Unless we think about changing the game also as part of our actions, the larger systems that we have in place. So it's again what I think Gandhiji was really trying to drive at Hind Swaraj, and with the idea of Swaraj is both the personal and the systemic questions have to be engaged with on a daily basis. And I just want to say the last thing I just want to share is that I think that we need to acknowledge that there is not only a visible forms of violence that are surrounding us, and those show up as symptoms every day, but the roots of this violence, I think there's an invisible daily war that is being fought, and it's been being fought for the last 500 years. The war against nature, war tells us, basically the narrative around that is that progress, human progress, is around expansionism, controlling resources, and accumulating resources. Our idea of progress, our idea of how we measure the purpose of life. So many young people, the ultimate question they get asked is, what is your package? So not what is your purpose, but what is your package? We need to replace that again with this narrative of what is your purpose? And I think many young people, thankfully, are starting to ask that question more and more. I think the global economic system and the global education system, these are war machines. We have unfortunately confused these as, again, measures of progress, but these are fundamental war machines designed to destroy the human spirit, destroy our relationships, bonds with nature. And I think, this idea of consumerism, which is fundamental to the kind of modern global lifestyle, is a war against the human spirit. It's a manufacturing of emptiness and inferiority in people. So I think that, we need to bring these questions into our conversations on leadership. I think also in our conversation on leadership, many of my colleagues and friends, we talk about the need for friction. So when I say friction, I mean, can we enter? And this was, I think, one of the most inspiring things I saw with Gandhi ji, is to be able to sit with the other, to sit with the people whose ideologies don't match ours, to sit with the quote unquote enemy. Can we sit with compassion and love and justice in those kinds of relationships? Can we invite those kinds of people, the Trumps of the world or the Bolsonaros of the world? Can we invite them into a conversation? I think this idea of actually larger systemic change cannot happen. It's not just the 99% who can bring the change or the 1%. It's actually all of us together need to change these systems, which are very violent and destructive on the planet. And the last thing I just want to share is that I would appeal that we, enter into one thing we're talking a lot these days is other forms of power. Again, we think of, I think Pietro was also mentioning that, not only the symmetry or the relationship of power, but even how we see power has to shift radically. Power is not in the military. It's not even in the political, government anymore. Power, all kinds of different power. I've been most inspired by the power I witnessed in my illiterate village grandmother. It was so powerful that I started to think that she was more intelligent and more wise than my Harvard professors. So the power that we get when we reclaim our bodies, when we reclaim our relationships with our sacred lands, when we reclaim our relationships with our ancestors, when we start to enter into all kinds of simple acts of kindness and care, there's huge amounts of power. And I think that a lot of the narratives around leadership overlook a lot of those small, beautiful things that we can start to do to reclaim sense of power and sense of community. So just wanted to share that for right now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Manish. I like that. Not only be the change, but change the game. We need to change the game. Wonderfully said. We'll now turn to Arsen, and Arsen, who's been involved in, as he said, a nonviolent revolution. He knows a lot about how there's gaps between words and deeds. How do you measure the success of, how would you measure the success of the Armenian nonviolent revolution, Arsen, in a perfect world? How would you see the present one referred in reference to ethical leadership that we've been talking about.
Thank you. Thank you, Jill. And there were all three talks were quite heavy with a lot of already, I think, discussed and digest.
Yeah, there, good, better.
Yes. So yes. Well, I'm a little bit concerned about discussing things with levels of global educational system and the global corporate culture. I really don't know, because we're actually in so many different ways, especially when it comes to smaller kind of oasis, claustrophobic level countries where you can't really travel much anyways. You don't have any sea around, and especially at times where things are locked down, it makes it even more visible and vivid how you can experiment with a lot of good ideas as well as a lot of bad ideas. It's a small system. We're not talking about the global education system, which I don't know what it is. We're dealing with many different approaches and thinkings, and I don't think that we're serving the war. In so many different ways, yes, we're probably contributing to the ongoing war machine, whatever was called by dear Manish, but also the understanding of how we're quoting Gandhi on Be the Change. We're quoting Gandhi on discussing how you should pursue him when he actually becomes someone like a prophet, where every 2 weeks he's being written so much that he can't say anything new. We're discussing how it's actually possible to make a major transformation, maybe a transformation, political transformation in most cases, but get to a point where the makers of the transformation are not necessarily the ones who can or should be leading and running a system at a time or at a situation which it is. So they start transforming everything else that depends on you and whatever else you depend on. Hence, you have much larger already existing corporate running machines that are pursuing and or dominating by ideas and technologies, where you are becoming a user, but at the same time are being used constantly, and you can't really break that because your general power of understanding of how to run things and knowledge and capacity is much lower. So you are in so many different ways feeling like a secondary player, but you're not accepting it because you think global. So whatever the global education system has to suggest when it comes to war and the war machine is something that I am also concerned, but I don't really know how to picture it or point it out so clearly. What I've heard from our other speaker, the dear Jay, is about understanding Gandhi and basically avoiding total obedience, which is you have to accept this as the change or whatever is named as that change as a religion, whatever you name it, and basically be completely obedient to whatever has been said dogmatically, whether it's a text or an actual person running things. Hence, you have to think twice before how you revalue your own role of being the change that you actually believe is true. Because whatever the situation changes around you personally, it is also your new status where you, if you are trying to be the best you think others should be, then you have to act like that. So however you act, you become a subject to your own limited, but mostly hopefully good understanding of how you want to be the change. And if it's a long run, not getting involved to the scale of the social media and other impositions that you are bound to, you try to figure out a way where you can actually act independently of the very active processes that are happening around you, and look at the process in a long context. So back in Armenia, I don't know how well I was understood. Back in Armenia, we are actually facing a very interesting period where we've had different periods of colonialism of different types and shapes depending on the period of the history. But we're now together. We're very homogeneous, sometimes a little too homogeneous. And so we are kind of stuck with being responsible for ourselves, and we're trying to figure out how that is going to be possible and how we're going to handle it. And what I am concerned about is that whatever we call the Velvet Revolution of Armenia of 2018, which was nonviolent, which actually believed in Gandhian ideals, there were people who actually ran the process, talking about whatever they've learned from Nelson Mandela, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and all the others that we have been following as larger believers of the nonviolent change and transformation. So everyone who is involved in the discussion, I believe, should be interested at least, but also supportive of a process that comes after, because again, as I've mentioned in my first interjection, I believe that we have a lot to learn from you and try not to mistake the same mistakes that we've seen in the world, and how we can actually make an oasis of the level of harmony, whether it's in this very particular context, whether it's in much larger, bigger organizational situations where you do have a true nonviolent, but not becoming a police state nonviolent existence, coexistence, cohabitation, but also not forgetting that whatever runs it is love. And so if you're going to lose the emotional part of what you're doing, you will basically be probably failing what you do. Or maybe when you hit too hard, you actually try to look for more sources, and I don't know what those will be.
But you know, what's interesting, Arsen, is people in India and Mexico and other places may not know is that really the Velvet Nonviolent Revolution 2 years ago in Armenia was completely carried out by the people of Armenia. It was not done by the outside. And you know, from that point of view, it's been interesting to watch people in the government, new government now, struggling with the issues of keeping their promises and really trying to maintain you know, a greater democracy, a greater equity, a greater nonviolence in the society. It's been a marvel to watch. Just for the other viewers.
What I would like to actually add here, Jill, I apologize. No, it is a very important point to make about what this specific revolution was and how endemic it was. It was how homegrown, home-based it was in reality. But if not for the values that revolution believed, and those values are, yes, fundamental freedoms, democracy, living in an understanding where we actually have rules of law that apply rather than are just written on the paper and known as theory.
Right. Yeah, and you know, I think like many other of the nonviolent revolution, it used the Indian freedom struggle somewhat as a model of carrying out a nonviolent freedom struggle. So very, very interesting. I just want to go back to Ila Gandhiji, Ila Ben, on the second question which we had, but actually I'm going to take the third one that I gave you as the second one, which is, you know, nonviolent leadership as exhibited by Gandhi was with a deep solidarity with the poor and marginalized, you know? And I'm just wondering, in your opinion, what are the best ways to assist young people today to embrace seva, to work close to the people, close to farmers, close to laborers, other marginalized sections, being with them, but not, of course, taking away their leadership, but by offering support. Do you want to say anything about that?
Yes, I think that is the crux of Gandhian leadership, because, you know, the involvement of the masses in his struggle was the most important thing. and how did he manage to get the masses to be involved? Now, you know, if we look at when he started the Satyagraha movement, the Salt Satyagraha or the Dandi March, he gave, I think it was about 15, you know, instructions, or he sort of taught the people, the Satyagrahis. He had chosen just, I think it was about 67 people who left Sabarmati with him. At the end, there were millions of people who participated, but the 67 that left with him were all properly trained Satyagrahis. And he said that if you fight a armed struggle, you have to undergo training. So when you are looking at a non-violent struggle, you also have to undergo training. A very strict discipline, a very strict way of doing things. And one of the key points that he made in those 15 different things is go to the village and listen to the people. Live with the people in their, you know, according to the way they live. Don't impose a different style of living there. Live in that style. Join them, do the work with them, help them, and listen to what they are saying. What are their needs? So what we see today sometimes in the modern leadership style is that many leaders think that they know what communities need. And therefore they would then go out and spend money on education. They think that the community needs education or housing or whatever it is that they have money for, and they go and build it. But they don't go and ask the community, is this what you need? Is this your priority? Because if they did, then the community may give them a different priority. Something that the community feels is important for the leaders to provide. And so that one point I would like to stress, that listen to the community and listen to what they are saying. Don't impose your ideas on the community, but you can educate the community. You can, like with COVID, nobody understands it. So you can go and teach people about what it is, and then listen to them and see how you can get an understanding and an informative or an informed decision from that discussion with the community. So it was a two-way thing. Education was one of it, and listening was the other side of it. And I think when we talk about new ways of education, people have been talking about new education, thinking, you know, differently about education. I think that those are some of the key points. And you know, when we in South Africa were talking about education during the apartheid days, we had read this book that's called Letters to Our Teacher. It was written by students in Italy. And they pointed out how the system was geared towards looking at the richer community and ignoring the knowledge that the poorer community brings to the table. So then people have knowledge. People have knowledge that is based from their environment, from their tradition, and so on. And they bring this knowledge to the table. And if we don't listen to that knowledge and see how we can build on that, we are missing the boat by providing something else and trying to change the person into a kind of robot that we want to see. And that is what our education system is doing today. It is producing people that we want to see developing in the future, a new, robots who just take information, no critical thinking, no, self sort of respect, where you know that you have certain skills. You unlearn those skills, or the teachers teach you to unlearn those skills and teach you new skills. And so you lose those old skills and that respect, self-respect that you had, because you are told that that isn't the right way. And yet who decides which is the right way and which is the wrong way? So I think that those are some of the issues that we need to grapple with going forward. There are a lot of issues. I started off by saying we haven't given the next generation a very good world to take forward. We have degraded the environment, we've degraded the education system, we have, created a consumerist society, we have created inequalities in the world. That is what we are leaving to the next generation. And so we really need to sit and think and use critical thought. So that's what I would like to think. And I think this is what Gandhiji had in mind when he, instructed the Satyagrahis. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you. That was very, very interesting. Wow. Can Pietro come in here and respond also to some of the things that Ilaben has said in terms of similarities, commonalities, or differences of viewpoint?
Yes, of course, and we are very in synchrony, I think all of us, and also with Ila, now me. I think it's important in the collective leadership we are speaking to look what's happening in two realities here in America. First, the movement Black Lives Matter and the indigenous civil resistance communities in Latin America against natural resources exploitation. They are two very good and interesting examples of collective and horizontal leadership, and we must learn more from them. Another thing important for us is this. We distinguish in a certain way between solidarity and struggle. The question asks for solidarian relationships, that it's for us a kind of second key step in nonviolence and peace culture, because the first step is indifference. So a big challenge for us is how to make young people pass from indifference to solidarian relations. But we try to work on another step, that is how to pass also from solidarian to struggle relations, because many times relations finish with a cross point, but we try that every one of us builds a kind of identity for all life in this kind of change, social change. So our key and most difficult challenge in education and in action is how to build ruptures in us and in others that make our become aware more deep and more clear in actions. That's our main challenge. And ruptures are intellectual, are epistemic in knowledge, because we distinguish very much between information and knowledge. Information doesn't change persons. What changes is building knowledge. And that's another process. It's not mechanical that I have a lot of information, I read a lot of papers and see videos and TV. I have the knowledge for making the social change. Not at all. And the most deep kind of rupture is the moral rupture that will take to different actions. But we believe that what makes moral ruptures is the epistemic rupture, not the information rupture. So that kind of work takes us to the point of the question that is very important, because one of the first steps in educational tactics and nonviolent tactics is to put the body close to people that struggle and suffer. And of course, that changes a lot in all of us. But we have learned in many years and decades, I would say, that that's not enough. If you are close to a situation of poorness and struggling, but you don't have the knowledge building and the reflection necessary, that will end quickly when you return home, or when you marry and have to take a job because you have sons and daughters. So we try to go deeply in that process. And in that sense, as I said, the question is how, in this direct experience, to build kind of ruptures that make higher the conscience awareness of reality. We call that how we can be changing our reality principle. And for example, some kind of actions recent that we have been doing and that work and most in young people, for example, is the social research of reality situations of violence, for example, gender violence in universities and schools, social research with a kind of method for awareness done by young people that make them change completely their identity and way of confronting authority. Because we do, for example, this kind of actions for making pressure to authority. They are moral weapons. We don't do them for publishing in a book or in a congress. We do them also as a kind of putting a real pressure to authority, and that had good experiences the last 2 years in universities in the country for making less the gender violence. Also, another thing that changed our reflection in part is working together with families of disappeared people. We have more than 62,000 in Mexico, disappeared people. It's a terrible thing in the last 10 years. And these families work and struggle in a non-cooperation way. They search clandestine graves by themselves. They understood that the state wasn't going to do that. So without asking permission, that I think is a very key nonviolent way of acting, they started building these actions and changing completely the dynamic of disappeared people in the country. So, for example, these have been 2 ways in non-cooperation and in social research as a reality principle in nonviolent action of breaking this power asymmetry and obtaining things that we didn't even expect to have in a short time.
Thank you, Pietro. This has been really fascinating. I see that Ria has come on the screen. Before we go to Manish, is there any questions that are, Ria, that are coming that you'd like to raise with the panelists?
There are questions. I am sending to the respective panelists in the chat box. You can just refer that. Right now, however, I understand that we've yet for this round of questions, I think Manish and Arsen has to speak yet. So I'm just trying to bring in the aspect of time. We've just got 15 minutes more left. So it would be good if we can quickly cover it up. Thank you.
Okay. So Manish, Bai, and Arsen, I think Manish, you covered that second question in your first intervention to some extent. I'm wondering if you can turn to the third question around inclusion. The question of, because this Jai Jagat campaign is a campaign of inclusion, and we're very keen to understand, how do you see in Shikshantar, in Swaraj University, the training of young people to be more inclusive in their leadership skill development, in their growth, if you will?
Yeah. Yeah, I just wanted to share a couple of things on the last question also, some practical things.
Sure.
One is, I think, in our work in Swaraj University and Shikshantar, I think these labels like poor, marginalized, backwards, illiterate, all of these are part of a very vicious knowledge hierarchy that has been created by the modern education system. And one of the when I was very young, first time I met Raj Gopalji, and I was impressed by the way that he wasn't relating to people as the masses. He was relating to people as each human being a source of richness, wisdom, knowledge, compassion, love. And I think that one of the things in our university is we try to break these labels. Many of these labels are destructive. They're against our own communities and people, and have been used to silence people many times when they've tried to question the development game, the globalization game. So I think that's one. And I think I'm also, remembered of, there's a very famous saying of the Maori, which is, if you have come here to if you have come here to solve our problems, you can go back home. But if you have come here because you feel your struggle for liberation is intertwined with our struggle for liberation, then we have much to share and talk about. So I think this is a kind of koan I've kept with myself for many years, and I share with many young people, is that we ourselves as middle class urban people are actually incredibly have been very much, we're very constrained. There's many things that we don't have, that actually people in rural areas and on the margins have very different kinds of power and resources that we need to tap into, very different kinds of strength. And I think that part of the crisis we're dealing with today, I think Pietro was referring to that, use the word epistemic crisis, I think, is that the worldview or the cosmovision that we are kind of stuck in, we need to unlearn that. We need to come out of that. I think Gandhiji showed us actually what was that when he went to the villages, it was part of his own unlearning journey. He had to unlearn most of the things that the modern European universities had taught him, and actually connect to that deeper wisdom of life that common everyday people hold. And so I think that the opportunity is not just of a solidarity, it's a profound, and I've had this in my own experience, my own journey, a profound unlearning journey. For us to, there's a I think a taboo word, taboo that we don't want to that Gandhiji raised. was the disease of Western civilization or modern civilization. I think we need to, everything around us is showing that Gandhiji was actually had anticipated the worst, and he understood that this is happening. So I think our own worldviews, the purpose of going to these communities is to actually challenge our own worldviews, to unlearn what we've learned. And I just want to share one thing we do. For example, it's very tricky. How do you do it? Because all of the modern state corporate power is imbued in us. We are carriers of this disease in many ways. So one thing we do is something we organize is called the Cycle Yatra. And it was inspired by Vinobaji and Gandhiji. And what we do is we send young people for a week on bicycles. None of them have any money. We're trying to strip away the kinds of modern institutional power. No money in your pocket, no phones or no cameras, no modern technology, no medicines with you, no plans. You don't know who you're going to meet. We're going to surrender ourselves to a very different logic of the universe, a different kind of cosmovision of the gift culture, what we call. So I think that, you know, this kind of thing is a profound experience, and many young people come away and say, actually, these people have the real power. We are the power. We've been made powerless. They have still, you know, I remember I went to Zimbabwe when the whole currency collapsed. The urban people were freaking out. The rural people knew how to grow their own food. They know how to make, how to kind of organize themselves even in crisis. And same thing happened in COVID. Many of the rural people were able to self-organize and manage their things quite easily. So I think that we need to start to shift, and we need to see rural people, the margins are where actually the real action is, where the new learning is happening, where the new knowledge is being created. And so how do we go there? And the last thing I just want to say is Gandhiji talked a lot about satyagraha. And I think we need to really engage young people in new models of satyagraha. One of the ways that we are doing it, we have a movement in India, we call it the walkouts movement. We are encouraging young people to walk out of schools, walk out of their dead universities, walk out of their corporate jobs, and actually walk on to actually creating a nonviolent society. It's not gonna, we're not gonna be sitting in these institutions and create. These institutions are part of the problem. And so we need to start to create new models. We actually have supported many people to create their own ecoversities. We have more than 150 around the world in 40 countries, and more communities are organizing, reorganizing their own knowledge production, knowledge sharing systems, and reclaiming those. So I think that this is part of the work that is necessary if we want to work with real people, with young people. Is we need to, I mean, they are looking for, the world needs us to raise the bar. The young people are ready to raise the bar. They're pushing us more, and we're still trying to salvage these dysfunctional institutions and systems. And I think that the time for a new imagination is very ripe, and people are very excited about that. And the margins, the people who don't have, you know, who have been less corrupted by Western civilization actually have a lot to teach us to go forward.
Manish, very, very interesting. Arsen, when we look at the nonviolent revolution 2 years ago in Armenia, we see it was mainly led by youth. And, you know, young people finally said enough is enough. And as you didn't hear earlier, Rajgopal was making the point that the young people really were the backbone of bringing nonviolence, in spite of many who wanted violence in Armenia, bringing nonviolence to the fore. Do you think that that was because there was a process of youth leadership building that happened in Armenian society over a period of time that created that? What do you think were the causes of that? Were there leadership models that young people were trying to emulate? Arsen, are you there? Arsen is there?
Jilbin, Arsen just dropped out. I think there was an internet problem. We'll see if we can get him back on track again.
Good. Okay. So we'll thank Arsen for his. I mean, Manish, the reason I veered the conversation away from a complete change of the development model is Arsen is working in the frame of politics. But I take your point very, very seriously, and let's now have a concluding statement from all of you, particularly related to the third question, if we could. I'd like to end with Ila Ben, if we can. Pietro, could you just look at the points of the third question and use it as a way to sum up a concluding statement? I know that's a tall order.
Well, trying to be synthetically, the question asks of inclusive. I think inclusive means empower young people. And that's the guarantee for power equalization. What means empower? Means to make them develop original and autonomous thinking, not obedience thinking. That's key for them in every step in life. And something very important in the work of young people in this line is to go at the rhythm of the most slow, not of the most fast, because otherwise you stay alone with 5. And in the other way, you walk more sure, but you stay more slowly, but you stay with 20. And being always, another important thing, behind the young people, not in front. That's key. Another thing for us very important is how to develop a due disobedience to inhuman orders. That's the name we give to nonviolence. And we must defend that kind of disobedience in everyday's life. And there we use 2 words that it taught an old priest about what's nonviolence characteristic. One is humble and the other is audacity. And we try to use that in many different strategic situations, in the level of actions, and in another key thing for us in nonviolent struggle. Actions must have a proportion with adversary actions. We don't fight alone, we fight with another one. And our struggle is a relation. So we must understand the adversary actions as we understand our own actions. That's the way we build this kind of awareness process.
Thank you, Pietro. And Ila Ben, may I ask you just to give a final comment to this session, perhaps referring to inclusive leadership that you had spoken about earlier?
I think that, today's society has got a number of boundaries that we have created. We create boundaries in terms of ethnicity, race. We create boundaries in terms of class. We create boundaries in terms of gender. I think that inclusivity for me means that we have to break down those boundaries and begin to look at all of us are together. There's no boundaries between us, and that everything that has to be done has to be shared. So there are also, when we create these boundaries, we also put in roles, that this is your role and this is my role. And often those roles become hierarchical roles. So, at the top you have the manager, and then you have all the other people below you. Now, those are the kind of boundaries. When I think Pietro or somebody spoke about horizontal, that is the kind of horizontal leadership that we need to have. If we are talking about inclusivity, we are talking about people coming together, each one being respected for what they bring to the table and having that kind of inclusivity. So break down the boundaries, that's what I'm saying. We need to systematically do that. Thank you.
Jai Jagat, Eminent. Wonderful, thank you. I want to thank all our panelists. Manish, do you want to just any final thought? You look very pensive. Just to conclude.
No, I feel like we're just warming. I feel like we're warming up with Ilaban and Pietro, so it's just starting to get juicy. I'm sad it's over. It's ending so soon. I just think that I would just bring one aspect is I think the social contract that dominated and framed the 19th and 20th century is being radically dismantled, and there needs to be an effort really of inclusion before we talk of inclusion, of renegotiating what is this social contract, whether it's with the state or whether it's with communities or whether it's with the systems that we have. So I think one thing, and the other thing is just really this rebuilding a culture of trust. I think that this is a fundamental thing, is trust, and how do we step out of the scarcity mindset? This is critical for us to move forward. We talk a lot about the gift culture. So any challenge of any framing of inclusion has to help us move beyond the narrow confines of the money system. And also the last thing I would just say is this, very important is we talk about the need for rebuilding intergenerational spaces. If we look around in our society, the spaces, I always say that real wisdom can only emerge when we have at least three generations together. So the spaces for this kind of wisdom is needed very much as we move forward with inclusion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ilaban, Pietro, and Manish Bhai. Thank you so much for this very enlightening session. This is the final session, and we're so delighted you were able to take us on this journey. I want to, before we close with our final song, which I hope you'll stay to hear, I want to thank our back-end workers, our Ria Simon, Janmajay Singh, Gary Nabil Singh, for all of the work you've done all day. It's 10 hours. I don't think they even had lunch or dinner. There was just constant work. And Ilaban, it shows the dynamic quality of the young people we have. It's been a pleasure to work with them. And as Manish says, we really see more and more changes going on with the young. And we've seen it in Jai Jagat. And the Jai Jagat family, we hope, will grow and be led by many of the young peace builders to make a better world. So thanking them, thanking our panelists, and most importantly, thanking our viewers for spending so long on the Zoom. All of you Zoomers, we thank you, and look forward to more Jai Jagat networking via webinars or physically in marches in future. Thank you very much, everybody. Please stay for the final song, which is to lift our spirits, inspire us to carry on in our quest for nonviolent leadership.